So when I lived in Arkansas, I tried my hand at farming. Now, for those of you who are real farmers, you know that farming isn't really what I'm talking about right now. But for those of you who've never been on a few acres of land and had chickens, I'm a farmer as far as you're concerned. I moved straight from the Seattle metro to rural Arkansas. We had a few acres. I built a chicken coop, and I wanted a rooster. And the rooster that I wanted was a specific type of rooster. I'd never purchased roosters before. I didn't even know where you go to purchase roosters. I didn't know if there was a rooster store or what. You can't really order them on the internet, so I found that you go to a feed store. When you go to the feed store, you have to order chickens and roosters, and then they order them for you, and then they give you whatever you order. And so when I went to the feed store, I asked the guy behind the counter, I said, I'd like to get a rooster. And he said, what kind? And I said, I don't know, a red one. And he said, what do you mean a red one? There are a bunch of kinds of roosters. And I said, foghorn leghorn, like a red one. And so he looked at me, sized me up, realized that I didn't know what I was talking about, and ordered me a red rooster, and then a whole bunch of chickens. Now, I liked my rooster, but my rooster ruled not just his chicken coop and his ladies, but he ruled my home for a period of time. My oldest son, Richard, was in junior high school at the time. Actually, I guess he just started driving. He was 15 years old and was driving himself back and forth to school on a special permit. And he drove a pickup truck that we parked out in the front yard. And the rooster terrorized my son, Richard. Now, Richard wore short pants to school in the summer, and the rooster would hide underneath the truck behind one of the wheels and wait for Richard to come out. When Richard came out for school, the rooster would come running out and charge Richard. And, he would have spurs up. And if you've never been around a full-size rooster, they have spurs that are they're long. And they have sharp toenails that, will hurt you. And they come up and they're flapping at you and they make all kinds of noise and it's terrifying. And so Richard would run back to the house. Now, he isn't here right now, so I can tell you, run back to the house screaming, help, Dad, help, the rooster, after me. Now, I named the rooster Satan at first, and Joy said that wasn't appropriate. So then his name was King Louie. King Louie is after me. I decided I need to figure out how to fight a rooster because nobody is going to terrorize my own home. So I did what you would do. I looked it up on the internet, how to fight a rooster. Now, you find all kinds of things on how to fight a rooster if you look that up on the internet. Please don't do it now, and don't do it on the church Wi-Fi. But when you fight a rooster, they tell you, look, you're going to have to kick this rooster square in the chest. And I said, I'm not kicking an animal. I like animal rights. I'm a soft-hearted guy. There's no chance I'm kicking a rooster. You change your mind when a rooster's charging you. You decide kicking a rooster's just fine. And so I'm trying to research, how do you kick a rooster? Where do you kick a rooster? What goes on? Now, I've observed, because I wanted to be prepared in advance, my rooster had some tendencies and before he engaged. One of his tendencies, his tells. You know what a tell is? A tell is what somebody does before they do something else, and they kind of predict. You can predict their behavior. Well, my rooster, he would act like he's not paying attention, and he would just be roostering in the ground, and then he would puff up. Try to make himself look bigger than he really is, like junior high boys do, they puff up, and then he would drop out the backside. He would, a rooster load, just a rooster poot. And he would poop. And then, I guess that was dead weight, eliminating dead weight. And then he would charge. And so he would do this every time. And so I walk outside to get my son to his truck to go to school. King Louie be down there roostering. He would puff up. I'm waiting for the poop. He poops, turns around and charges. So the first time I'm ready for him. Now, I've been studying. What kind of kick do you use when you kick a rooster? Do you use a front kick? Do you use a side kick? Do you roundhouse him? What do you do? Well, it turns out when a rooster's charging you just flail your legs like crazy and hope you make contact. And the rooster charged to me. As he charged me, I kicked him square in the chest. Boom! Knocked him back. And I'm like, yes! They didn't tell me that they charge again. The rooster charged again. Boom! I kick him, right? And I'm considering retreat at this point. But not my house. I'm fighting this rooster to the death. I bet I kicked King Louie 9 times, 10 times. Finally, he gave up. Let us walk to the car. But it took preparation. It took commitment. It took me deciding that I was going to do something. Not my house. I'm going to rescue my son. The story I'm going to tell you today from the life of Abraham is similar in some ways and then a lot different in others. His life was on the line, but he was on a rescue mission doing something with his faith. This story involves preparation ahead of time, making sure that we're ready when the moment comes to do something with what we say we believe. It involves a moment when you decide it's time for action. I'm not going to sit around and talk about it anymore. I'm going to do something with my life. We're going to act. And then, best of all, it includes a moment where the entire world is watching, at least the world in Canaan. the world that was important to Abram at this moment in time. And he had earned the right by doing something with his faith, where everyone was paying attention and listening to what he was going to say. And instead of pointing everybody to himself, he pointed them to God. Because he did something to be able to earn that voice. And when he did, he pointed it in the right spot. This passage is one that many people skip. Matter of fact, I was going to skip it because we have a lot of ground to cover. And at this rate, if you're familiar with the story of Abraham, and you know this is an 8-week series, it probably could be a 32-week series with the pace that I'm going. I was going to skip it, but I can't. Because this story has gripped my heart and personally motivated me and encouraged me, challenged me in ways that I was absolutely not expecting. And I've been praying all week that it would do the same for you. So we're going to dive in. I'm going to point you to a couple things, and then I'm going to call you to action. But we're a group of people who are called to be on a rescue mission. And when we earn the right to influence the world around us, we point them toward Jesus. Are you ready? Oh, that was less than encouraging. If you say yes, we get done faster. All right, here we go. Some of this is not going to be immediately interesting to you. Keep in mind that the people who experienced this story after it was recorded in the first place, these people, these dates, these times, the environment, the topography was all really relevant to them. For us, it's more principle, even though they were literal, real places and people and events. But we're going to work through these names. You don't need to know many of these names and remember them or even know the places, but just focus on the principles as I try to stop at least 3 times and explain to you what's going on behind the scenes and how powerful this story is as Abram continues to learn and live this life of faith. At the time when Amphraphel was king of Shinar and Arioch king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, now remember him, he's the chief bad guy, the king of Elam, and the title king of Goyim. It sounds like Lord of the Rings or something, but real places, real people, this stuff really happened. These kings went to war against Bera, king of Sodom. You probably know the name Sodom. Bersha, king of Gomorrah. You probably know the name Gomorrah. Shinab, king of Admar. Shimber, king of Zoyim. And the king of Bela, that is Zor. And these latter kings joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Dead Sea Valley. For 12 years they had been subject to Chedorlaomer, but the 13th year they rebelled. Now here's what happened. You have 2 different coalitions. Now oftentimes there were coalitions of kings. The kings back in this day weren't kings like you might expect, where they had huge kingdoms and they had all sorts of people with tens of thousands of subjects. These were usually people who lived in a walled city who had a group of henchmen that they had trained, and they called themselves king. They were kings of their own domain. Now, if they lived near other kings, they would try to form alliances for protection or extortion. So there were a group of dirtbag kings that had formed together with very powerful armies that were extorting another group of dirtbag kings. Now, I say that they're dirtbag kings because the Bible says that. Pretty soon, the children of Israel are instructed to wipe all of them out because there's no good in any of them. But you have one dirtbag group that's stronger than the other dirtbag group, and so they're making them pay them for protection. And then the other dirtbag group over here, the weaker one with Sodom and Gomorrah, these kings being part, said, enough. We're done paying. We're not paying anymore. Do whatever you want to do. We dare you. So the battle lines were drawn. Unfortunately, it didn't end well for the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah, but it took a year for Chedorlaomer, the chief bad guy of the dirtbag kings with better military, to rally his forces, to organize what he wanted to do, and to actually wage an attack. So the 13th year they rebelled, but in the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings allied with him went out and defeated the Rephaites in Ashtaroth, Karnam, and the Zuzites in Ham, the Emites in Shaveh Kirithaim, and the Hiratites in the hill county of Ser, as far as El Paran near the desert. Then they went back and they went to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and they conquered the whole territory of the Amalekites. Now, if you're a Bible guy, you know the Amalekites. That comes up quite a bit. And the Amorites, that comes up also. And they were living in Hezzon Tamar. All right. Whew. So we know what happened. They're wiping out all these people. They said, we're going to kill you if you don't give us the money that we ask you for protection. The weaker group of kings said, we're not giving you money anymore. So the good group, or the bad group of strong kings, is taking out the other group, and the drama, the plot is thickening. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zor, if that helps us out any, marched out and drew up their battle lines in the valley of Siddim. So they're going out to fight him. Now keep in mind, they're going out to fight him on their own territory. These are kings that don't live here, who are the offensive, the aggressive. Sodom and Gomorrah knew the area. They knew the territory, these kings. They had a particular advantage they failed to use. Now, me not having any military experience, I still know that when you're fighting in familiar territory, you can use some of the topography to your advantage. They chose not to do that, and in fact, they found that it trapped them. So they had marched out. They set up their battle lines. It was 4 kings against 5. Now, the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits. And when the king of Sodom and Gomorrah fled after they were being beaten, some of the men fell into them, and the rest fled into the hills. Now, pay attention to the hills you'll need later when we go back and talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, because Lot fled into these very same hills a little bit later. The 4 kings seized all of the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all of their food, and then they went away. They also carried off Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions, since he was living in Sodom. Now, do you remember last week when we talked about Lot? We talked about the choice that Lot made. There had to be a separation. There had to be something that changed. They couldn't travel together any longer. And so Abram said to Lot, you've got to leave. He said, Lot, choose whatever you want. So Lot looked to the east, looked to the west, and he chose the better land that was over near Sodom. Even though he shouldn't have chosen the better land, he should have preferred his uncle. And even though he should have been concerned about making choices that honored the Lord, he chose evil people, a fertile land, disrespected his uncle, and should have, in my mind and probably in yours, suffered whatever consequences came with making really bad decisions. There was a crisis. The crisis was that Lot had been kidnapped. They carried off Abram's nephew Lot, all of his possessions, since he was what? Now he was living in Sodom. Last week we talked about the fact that he had pitched his tent near Sodom. So Lot had crept a little further and further toward a city that was considered habitually, perpetually, terminally wicked to the Lord. So he's living in Sodom. He's living in Sodom, and he gets kidnapped, and all of his stuff gets confiscated. Now, there are a lot of people who are kidnapped with him, and a lot of stuff that's confiscated. They carry him off. Now, back in the day, men were a commodity. Women, of course, were as well. They would raise children up. They were slaves until they could fight. If they couldn't fight, then sometimes they would kill them or sell them to somebody else. But they were kidnappers. They were men stealers. They were called that oftentimes in the Old Testament. So raiding kings would go in, and they would steal people. They would kidnap them and force them into serving them. Now, the Bible makes a very clear point that Abram had men who were born into his household, which doesn't mean that they were born as babies into his household. It means they were freeborn men who chose to form an alliance with Abram because they were taken care of, and to serve him because they wanted to, not because they were kidnapped. It's significant. But there's a problem, and I believe that the crisis of another person should be a call for action. But we don't always act that way. My wife was a preschool director and a preschool teacher for years and years. And when she parented my boys, she was really good at it. She had something she called natural and logical consequences. You guys know what that is? Probably not just a parenting concept, but for my wife it was. She used it on me, and I didn't care for it nearly as much as I did when she used it on my boys. Let me give you an example. Let's say you got a 3 or 4-year-old, 5-year-old, whatever, and they pick up a Tonka truck. They're made of plastic now. They used to be metal when I was a kid. Let's say they pick up a Tonka truck and smack another kid in the head with it, right? What do? You take the truck away. You say, you can't play with the truck anymore. We don't hit people. That's a natural and logical consequence. Smack somebody with the truck, lose the truck. Don't hit. You learn not to hit. That's our value system. Our value system as people is natural and logical consequence. Lot chose poorly, disrespected his uncle, didn't care about God. You deserve what you get. I hope you die. If not, I hope you at least suffer. I hope you learn your lesson. That's the human way to think about it. But we serve a God who's not a God of natural and logical consequences. Do you understand where you and I would be if God was a God of natural and logical consequences? We would be destined to a well-deserved eternity in hell with no hope for peace with God if God gave us what we deserved. But God is a rescuer. He's a rescuing God. Jesus came to earth, 100% God, but at the same time 100% man, and lived a perfect life, but endured so much hardship to rescue us, to offer us what we didn't deserve. By God's grace, and just because of our faith. And so there's a mindset or a heart, and it should be the motivating, organizing principle behind a person of faith. That we are called to rescue, that we are on a rescue mission, and it has nothing to do with the people around us and whether they deserve to be rescued or whether they don't. That we, like Jesus, are rescuers. That the gospel is what rescues. And the crisis of another is a call to action. So, Abraham very quickly is going to have to choose. A man who had escaped came and reported to Abram the Hebrew. Important that the Hebrew is used here for the first time in this way in the Bible, used many times later. Now Abram was living near the great trees of Mamre the Amorite, a brother of Eshcol and Aner, all of whom were allied with Abram. Interesting to note that Abram had formed some alliances where he lived too. Over in the land that wasn't quite so great, over in the area that Lot hadn't chosen, he had formed some alliances, some people who were allied with him. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he called out 318 trained men born into his household, and he went in to pursue as far as Dan. Now, working backwards, Dan was an important crossroads. It was a kind of a important landmark where everybody knew the city of Dan. And Kedorlaomer had sort of recessed back with his possessions, with all the spoils of war, all the people he had kidnapped, back to this crossroads. Abram, the word came to him. As soon as the word came to him that Lot was in trouble, he could have ignored it. He could have said, you know what, it's Lot's problem. I got to worry about me. It's not a good time right now. Things are complicated. Money's tight. I just need to, kind of do mine. We're going to be back here, and, I wish him well. I hope everything goes okay for Lot. We may lob some prayers over the wall and say, God, please bless him. No, he doesn't. As soon as Abram hears that there's a need, he responds. He responds immediately. In the Bible, the Hebrew says that when he called out his 318 fighting men, two important things. The word called out is like unsheathing a really sharp sword that had been prepared for battle. So these men were prepared. Abram prepared. He prepared ahead of time for the moment when he would be called out, for the moment where God would need to use him. And it reminds me of the importance of us preparing ourselves to be used by God to be rescuers. Part of what you're doing right now is preparing yourself. Part of what we do on Wednesday evenings in city groups, it's not so that we can sit around in meetings talking about all the things we should be doing. It's so that we can prepare ourselves to go out and to rescue. Now, don't get me wrong. When I say rescue, I'm not the rescuer. The gospel's the rescuer. I'm just a person who's been rescued. The power lies in the gospel and the Holy Spirit. I'm just the person who chooses to go. A sinner saved by grace through faith, not by good works, so that no one can boast. Just because God chose to love me. Abram responded. The called out men, trained, sharp sword, sent them, deployed them immediately. Men born into his household. He went and pursued as far as Dan. So I asked the question, why? He was risking his life, risking his men, risking his assets, risking his reputation. I told you last week that it's important for us to care more about our character than our reputation, that when we live doing what God's asked us to do, we don't have to be afraid of anything that we're doing. All we have to be afraid of is disappointing God. So he responds in the moment, and I wonder why. And I think, this is just me thinking, you can think your own thoughts, but I'd like to suggest mine. I think in this moment he's thinking about his own life so far. His own stumbling, bumbling, feeble walk of faith. His most recent trip to Egypt, where he'd ask his wife to lie for him, to say that they were brother and sister, finding herself waiting in Pharaoh's harem to be one of his wives, getting rich off of a lie and a deception, having made mistakes that there is no way to undo. And what happened? God rescued him. Did he deserve it? No. What did he deserve? He at least deserved to be infested with the same disease that Pharaoh's other wives and men got. But God, not natural and logical consequence, but full of grace and full of mercy, is a rescuing God. So what did Abraham do? Well, he did what God had done for him. He acted. The call of the faithful is a call to rescue. So off he goes. Now, the story may be predictable by this point since I've sort of told you how it ended. I'm going to read it anyway. During the night, Abram, he divided his men to attack them, and he routed them. Now, most historians think that he snuck around behind, divided into sections. There were 318 of his men, possibly a few others from some of his allies. There were probably several thousand bad guys, and defeated him. But we know that it wasn't Abram's own strength and own wisdom. We're going to see in just a few minutes that it was God who was doing all of the hard stuff. But he routed them, which means soundly defeated them, pursuing them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. Let's keep going. He recovered all the goods and brought back his relative Lot and his possessions, together with the women and the other people. After Abram returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him. Now the story changes, and there are two people now that are really significant. Well, three if you count Abram. The king of Gomorrah and the king of Sodom. Now I want you to remember, I want you to think about this. What we've seen so far is that Abram defeated the king who had the army that defeated everybody. You don't need to focus on the names. Everybody in the area had been defeated. All of them. And here comes Abram with 318 men, pursuing them, dividing his forces, destroying the armies, and then coming back with all the possessions that had been stolen, all of the men and women and children that had been kidnapped, and it says Lot mentions him by name. So you have two people who come out and meet him. The entire world is watching. Why? Because by this point, his action, listen to this, it's really important. His action has earned him the right to influence the world around him. And everyone's watching. What's he going to say? It's his moment. Now we, as a church, we're structured around earning the right to influence the world around us by loving and serving them. We have 18 different teams of people who go out each month into all areas of the Des Moines metro and act. Is it a rescue mission? Absolutely. Do all of them need to be rescued? Not necessarily. But we go out into the world around us, not worrying about ourselves, done with the meetings where we sit around and talk about all the stuff we should be doing, but have decided we're going to go do it. And we pray, God, give us influence. Well, who does he give us influence with? He gives me influence with the friend who I take with me to go and to serve and to love these teachers, law enforcement officers, these soldiers. My unsaved neighbor who I invite to go with me. And he finds that he has the desire to do this because the desire to rescue is in all of us. We just don't always know why. And as we serve together, I say, hey, you know what? This is the reason we do this. It's because of the gospel. Isn't it fun? Doesn't it feel right? I take my friend who's looking for a church home, not somebody who already has a happy church home, somebody who's looking for a church home. Then they know a church is supposed to be a rescuing church, a doing church, an acting church, an outward-focused church. And I take my friend and I say, come with me and serve. Let me show you what it looks like when we get outside our walls and go do something with our faith. Doesn't it feel right? Because we serve a rescuing God, and all we're doing is what he does. So Abram is coming back, having earned this moment, humble and the world is watching. That's my prayer. My prayer for all of our teams, for all of our captains, for our church, is that we earn the right to be able to influence. And when we have these moments, and we have had and have them all the time, that we do the right thing with these moments. Because this is where so many fall short. Abram's humble. We have to be humble. Our church has to be humble. Which doesn't mean that we think less about ourselves. It means that we think about ourselves less. So here he comes. Abraham returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings that were allied with him. The king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Sheva. That's the king's valley. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest, or a priest, of the God Most High. Now, Melchizedek, huge question mark. And people who study the Bible, much, much smarter than me, they don't exactly know who Melchizedek was. Now, Melchizedek, for our purposes here in this story, represents the one true God. He represents the one true God. He is described as a priest. The word that's used to describe him is one that's very consistent and familiar throughout the Old Testament, but the New Testament tells us that he was a priest unlike any other priest, and it has all kinds of questions associated with that we can talk about a different time. But Melchizedek, king of Salem, which means peace, which eventually ended up becoming Jerusalem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. He blessed Abram, saying, and this is a great reminder, isn't it? Blessed be Abram by God Most High. Who is it that gave you the opportunities that you've been given? Who gave you the ability to do what you just did? Who gave you the riches that you enjoy? Who gave you the success that you are experiencing? You've been blessed by God. It's a fantastic reminder. God's the creator of heaven and earth. And praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. Now remember that. We're going to come back to this as we conclude in just a minute. Then the king of Sodom, man, the audacity of this guy. I can't stand him. That's probably not nice to say. He said to Abraham, hey, give me the people back that I lost. You can keep the stuff. I'd be like, thanks. I just whipped the guy who whipped you. You ought to be lucky I'm not whipping you just because of your attitude. He didn't say it, but he didn't take anything from this guy. He's in his moment where he can use his influence that he has earned, that God has given him. He's in his moment, and he could use it for personal gain. He could have gotten richer. He could have said, I'm the man. I did this. You guys pay me for protection. I'm the new kid on the block. Things are going to be different around here. But he didn't. Humble. The king of Sodom said, give me all the people, you can keep the stuff. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, with a raised hand, I have sworn an oath to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you. Not even a thread or the strap of a sandal. Now that's a contextual saying that means I'm not taking even a penny. It's like the lowest of the possessions. So that you or no one else will be able to say, I made Abram rich. I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten and the share of belongings to the men who went with me. To Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them have their share. So what did he do in his moment of influence? Abram worshiped the Lord. He gave a tenth of everything he had and offered praise to the one true God. So the world around him who was watching, in the moment that God had given him, saw a man who wasn't selfish. A faithful life, a faithful person is a person who's chosen not to be selfish. But can I suggest to you that a faithful church is a church that refuses to be selfish? Because after all, a church is just made up of people. And in that moment, he chose not to be selfish. He was willing to sacrifice. A faithful person is willing to sacrifice, which means that we don't always get what we want, but we're willing to do whatever it takes to be a rescuer. Are we willing to be a church of sacrifice? Abraham was fearless, not because he trusted himself, but because he trusted in the one true God. Are we people who are fearless? Are we a church that's fearless? Abram was humble. He didn't think less about himself. He just chose to think about himself a little less. I want us to be people who are willing to think about ourselves a little less. I want us to be a church, a rescuing church, that's willing to think about itself a little less. To look at the crisis of the world around us as a call to action and a call for the gospel. To earn the right to share our faith by loving and serving the world around us to a saving relationship with the Lord. And when we get our moment, we point people to Jesus. There was a group of people in the 1800s. This is in conclusion, so y'all can listen up. Everybody likes that when a pastor says that. That's why I don't often say it. I also don't often use historical analogies because they don't connect. But I'm doing it now because this one connects. In the 1800s, there was a really dangerous stretch of coastline off the coast of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in Massachusetts Bay. There was a series of extremely deadly storms that came one after the other, causing massive loss of life from shipwreck. Women, children, men died. The people in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts knew they had a problem. They all acknowledged that they had a problem. People were dying. Finally, a few of them got together and decided they were going to do something about it. They said, we have to do something because people around us are dying. What can we do? So they gathered more like-minded people who were willing to do something, who saw that the crisis of another was a call to action. And as they got together, they chartered or agreed on a mission. We're rescuers. They pooled their own money, many times buying their own supplies, sacrificing to buy lifeboats, lifelines. They chose to build 18 different stations up and down the coast in the most strategic, dangerous spots. They chartered, called themselves the Humane Society of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, not having anything to do with the Humane Society animal rescue organization today, but begin to train for their mission, because training is part of it. I mean, we have to train for our mission. We can't not train. That's why we meet together on Wednesdays, Sunday nights, Sunday mornings. But we train so that we can rescue, so that we can go. And they trained, and they formed great friendships as they trained. And then they were deployed voluntarily to these 18 different stations during storms, taking shifts around the clock, risking their lives in rowboats, going out to save people from shipwreck. And this mission that they had was contagious. I mean, people from all walks of life were coming and signing up and getting involved, and we're giving sacrificially, and we're training with intention, and we're going out with their friends and doing something with what they decided was important enough to do. And then over time, the mission became a little inconvenient. But they still loved hanging out with their friends. They still went to their 18 different outposts. They still had their meetings. But instead of going out and doing it, they started talking about the things they should be doing. Over time, they took fewer and fewer rescue missions, but had more and more meetings. Then deciding that all they needed to do was really raise money so that other people could go out and rescue. And then pretty soon, even the passion for that kind of stopped. And instead of it being the Humane Society of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, established in 1845 to rescue the drowning, they changed it, and it became the Humane Society Social Club, where they got together and hung out with their friends and had practically and functionally forgotten their mission. We can't let that happen. But it happens to people and to churches all the time. Let's be people of action, people of faith, people like Abraham, because God rescued each of us. Father, thank you for my friends.